Night falls long before history begins, and if you imagine the Earth from far out in space turning slowly in the sun's light, you see the first fact about the night. It is not a curtain that descends, but a frontier that moves, a band of shadow forever flowing westward along mountains and oceans, never still, never absent, only passing from one face of the planet to another as the Earth rotates once every 24 hours, while above that turning globe the stars remain almost unchanged, burning with the same light that shone on mammoths and stone tools and silent fireless camps. For early humans, night was not a romantic backdrop but a physical danger, thick with teeth and claws and cold, and before the domestication of fire, darkness belonged to other hunters whose eyes were built for it. Big cats whose retinas caught every trace of stray starlight, wolves moving as a coordinated shadow, hyenas laughing in unseen circles around a sleeping band of Homo erectus huddled in a ravine or a stand of scrub, trying to press as close as possible to one another for warmth in the chill that comes when the sun's heat bleeds away. Archaeologists reading the record of that fear find it in negative space, in the depths of caves where paintings appear only far from the mouth, where traces of soot from stone lamps and torches mark the walls, proof that people carried light into places where the ordinary eye fails, bringing with them not just illumination but a sense of control, because light inside darkness is a claim, a refusal to surrender entirely to the night outside. The earliest lamps we know, shallow stone bowls, black night then became both menace and calendar, a book of light points that could be read. And when the first settled civilizations emerged in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt and the Indus, their priests and scribes formalized what nomads had already sensed. That careful watching of the night sky allowed one to predict not only seasons, but perhaps the favor or anger of the gods, and so on baked clay tablets in ancient Babylon around the 2nd millennium BCE, scribes recorded star lists and omen collections like the great series known as Enuma Anu Enlil, where the behavior of the moon and planets overnight, whether a halo appeared, whether a star blinked out in eclipse, stood as coded messages about kingship, war, or flood. The Babylonians divided the night into watches rather than hours, carving it into 3 or sometimes 4 segments marked by changes of guard or ritual, and those watches gave structure to their military and religious life. A night watchman on the city wall did more than look for enemies. He listened for the sounds of the dark, dogs barking in scattered bursts, a sudden silence over the reeds of the river, the steady lap of water against the quays, and interpreted them as signs of safety or warning, all under a sky they had mapped with astonishing accuracy, noting the rising and setting times of key stars in the compendium known as Ol-Apin. In Egypt, night carried a more mythic geography, because for the ancient Egyptians the sun god Ra did not simply vanish below the horizon. Each evening he entered the western sky as a door into the underworld, sailing on a bark through 12 caverns corresponding to the hours of night, facing serpents and demons and the monstrous serpent Apophis. In the hymns of the Rig Veda from ancient India, composed perhaps between 1500 and 1200 BCE, night itself appears as a goddess, Ratri, wrapped in robes of darkness, bringing rest to men and beasts, driving away dangers with the same hand that introduces them. She's praised for covering the world like a mother tucking in her children, but also invoked to keep at bay the wolves and thieves and ghosts that roam when the campfires burn low, hinting at a worldview in which night is not purely evil, but a necessary complement to day, an alternating rhythm woven into the cosmic order of Dharma. On the Indian subcontinent, astronomers working in later centuries, such as those behind the Siddhantas, spent countless clear nights measuring lunar mansions, the nakshatras, which divided the ecliptic into segments tied to particular stars, and these divisions, visible only against the black backdrop of night, underpinned horoscopes, calendars, and sacrificial timings that regulated royal and agrarian life. The darkness of the sky thus silently structured when fields should be ploughed, when pilgrimages should be undertaken, and even when kings should be crowned. Far to the east, Chinese observers made the night sky into a kind of celestial bureaucracy, reflecting the imperial court on Earth. By the 1st millennium BCE, they had recognized some 300 asterisms, grouping stars into constellations that mirrored palaces, halls, and offices, and court astronomers, often working in special observatories on palace grounds, kept meticulous night logs. Since a comet's sudden appearance or an eclipse, yet even within these curfews, night invited transgression. In the narrow lanes behind respectable courtyards, there were always wine shops willing to keep a lamp burning beyond legal hours, poets who slipped out to meet courtesans under the thin light of sliver moons, and storytellers who specialised in ghost tales told best when oil lamps flickered low, and the famous collection Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio by Pu Songling, written in the 17th century, is full of scenes where scholars reading late at night encounter fox spirits or spectres, precisely because the hours thinned the boundary between the ordered day and the more fluid world of the unseen. Across the Pacific, in Mesoamerica, night was equally charged with meaning. For the Mayan, the movements of Venus, often visible just before dawn or after sunset, were tracked with extraordinary care, and the Dresden Codex contains tables allowing priests to predict when this star would appear as morning star, associated with warfare and sacrifice, so that campaigns could be launched under auspicious nocturnal configurations, while in the great cities like Tikal or Chichen Itza, temple stairs were aligned so that on particular nights and twilights, patterns of shadow and starlight would create visual illusions, such as the serpent of Kukulkan seeming to ripple down the pyramid at equinox. The peoples of Polynesia developed a still different relationship with night as highway. On the open Pacific, where there were no mountains to silhouette against the stars, in these Greek cities, time at night was increasingly carved into finer units, thanks to water clocks or clepsydrae, which dripped at a roughly constant rate and could be calibrated to mark off, for example, the length of a speech in court or the duration of a night watch. And these devices, often used indoors by lamplight, reveal that even before modern clocks, people were wrestling the fluid, enveloping character of night into segments that could be managed, rationed, and sold, whether in the form of service, labour, or oratory. The Romans, inheriting and amplifying Greek institutions, added their own layers to nocturnal life. Their cities were notorious for being dangerous after dark, and satirists like Juvenal joked about the perils of walking home at night along streets slick with refuse and crowded with drunken revellers and lurking thieves. Yet at the same time, traders, bakers, and carters often preferred to move goods under cover of darkness to avoid the daytime crowds and summer heat, so that the pre-dawn hours in Rome saw heavy wagons rumbling toward the markets by lantern light, the smell of newly baked bread curling into alleys where the wealthy still slept. Roman households that could afford it burned oil lamps made of terracotta or bronze, with intricate designs cast on their surfaces, sometimes pornographic, sometimes devotional, and these lamps turned night into a dappled interior twilight, where walls danced with flame shadow, while outside, the city's rudimentary lighting, occasional torches or braziers. When the Western Empire collapsed and Europe fragmented, the night did not revert to pure wildness, but its moral and symbolic charge deepened under Christianity. Church writers often contrasted the children of light with those who loved darkness, a metaphor that drew on real practices because monastic communities structured their days around the divine office, with specific hours of prayer including vigils or matins in the deep of the night, when monks would rise from sleep, file into chilly chapels, and chant psalms by candlelight, believing that this sacrifice of comfort opened a privileged channel to God. In secular towns, however, night was increasingly framed as a time of suspicion. By the Middle Ages, many cities in northern Europe had curfew bells, a direct descendant of the Norman French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, rung each evening to signal that households should bank hearths and not let open flames burn unattended, both as a fire precaution and as an informal boundary marker beyond which ordinary people were not expected to wander, so that those found outdoors after curfew might be treated as potential criminals, spies, or prostitutes. Yet daily life always leaks around such rules, and historians piecing together lawsuits, sermons, and folk tales find that medieval night was filled with more variety than official records suggest. Neighbours gathered silently in adjoining houses to share a communal oven's residual warmth. Lovers slipped out disguised in hooded cloaks. Smugglers used the cover of darkness to move untaxed salt or wool, and travelling minstrels performed in halls lit by torches, their songs often dwelling on the events that took place by night: secret births, miraculous apparitions, thefts, and escapes. But not all medieval and early modern nights were defined by horror. There was also laughter and play, as in the charcuterie and carnival traditions where masked youths roamed streets after dark, banging pots and pans to shame an unpopular marriage or lampoon a local official, their anonymity ensured by both costume and dimness. And in university towns like Paris or Bologna, student brawls and pranks often erupted at night when academic authorities found it harder to control their charges, turning certain quarters into noisy, unpredictable theatres of youthful misbehaviour under the stars. One of the most intriguing facts about pre-modern nights in Europe is the pattern of segmented sleep that social historian A. Roger Ekirch brought to wide attention. Diaries, medical manuals, and literary references from before the 19th century frequently mention a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by a waking interval of an hour or two around midnight, when people would rise, stoke the fire, pray, talk quietly, sometimes visit neighbours, even engage in sex. Treating this watchful pause as a normal, almost expected part of the night's rhythm, suggesting that the consolidated 8-hour slumber many take for granted today is not a timeless human norm, but a product of later social and technological changes. This middle-of-the-night wakefulness, taking place in low light when senses are alert but the outside world is hushed, added a contemplative dimension to darkness. Manuals of devotion recommended specific prayers for that interval, believing that petitions offered between sleeps had special efficacy. And one can imagine in many Muslim cities during Ramadan, the night also became the main axis of social life, because fasting from dawn to sunset pushed meals into the dark hours, and traditions developed around the suhoor, the pre-dawn meal, which in some regions was heralded by a musaharati, a drummer or caller walking through alleys, beating a small drum or singing verses to wake residents, turning the final, often quietest watch of the night into a communal rhythmic moment linking scattered households through a shared soundscape. Scientific astronomers of the Islamic Golden Age, such as al-Battani, al-Sufi, and later Ulugh Beg, produced star catalogues that corrected and expanded upon Ptolemy's work, and their patient measurement of star positions, brightness, and motion was conducted mostly during cold, clear nights on observatory platforms, wrapped in heavy cloaks against the chill, using armillary spheres, sextants, and quadrants, whose sight lines had to be aligned on faint points of light so that every data entry in their tables represents not just abstract calculation, but an actual human eye squinting into darkness, steadying a breath to keep a star's image fixed on a mark. With the voyages of discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, night at sea took on new prominence for Europeans. While sailors had long used the North Star, Polaris, as a rough indicator of latitude, the pressing need to cross open oceans without land in sight pushed navigational astronomy into a more systematic practice, and pilots learned to shoot the altitude of stars with increasingly refined instruments, comparing them to tables that predicted where those stars should appear at particular times and dates, effectively treating the night sky as a gridded. By the 17th century in Europe, cities like Paris and Amsterdam were beginning what historians sometimes call nocturnalization, a process in which the wealthier classes gradually claimed the night as a time for sociability and entertainment rather than fear, and a key technological catalyst for this shift was the introduction of organised street lighting. In Paris, under the direction of officials like Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, authorities ordered thousands of lanterns hung at regular intervals along main thoroughfares from 1667 onward, each lamp tended by assigned caretakers, so that visitors marvelled at the unprecedented sight of long avenues bathed in a continuous, if flickering, glow. These early streetlights relied on candles or oil, their flames shielded by glass against wind, and their appearance immediately altered the social texture of the city after sunset. Promenades became possible in areas once avoided, shop windows stayed open longer to entice passers-by, and crime patterns shifted as thieves adjusted to a world where darkness was not homogeneous, but broken by islands of light and shadow, enabling ambushes in some spots, but making stealth more difficult in others, while moralists frowned at the sight of carriages still rolling at midnight, carrying nobles from salons to masquerade balls. London, too, adopted street lighting in the late 17th century, using oil lamps mounted on lampposts or iron brackets, and the city's infamous watchmen with their rattles and halberds patrolled lanes, crying the hours past 3 o'clock on a fair morning, providing not just security but an audible time signal for insomniacs peering through shutters. Yet their inefficiency became a stock joke, and satirical prints depict them asleep indoors. Theatres also thrived in this new nocturnal world. Opera houses in cities like Venice, Vienna, and Naples opened their doors in the evening and did not close them until near midnight, their interiors vast caverns of concentrated light and sound in an otherwise dark landscape, and to step out from a performance into a chilly street, with only a few lanterns glowing, must have felt like crossing a boundary between two realities, the stage brightness of art and the more modest, practical illumination of commerce and transit. Even as elites made the night fashionable, intellectuals continued to mine it for symbolism and scientific data. Philosophers and naturalists wrote about the unique qualities of nocturnal sounds, the way footsteps echo differently on frozen winter streets versus summer dust, the particular hush that falls over a snowy countryside at night when sound is absorbed rather than reflected. And astronomers like Galileo, peering through early telescopes in the early 17th century, made epoch-making discoveries about the moon's cratered surface and Jupiter's moons by aiming lenses into the darkness and transforming specks of light into detailed, textured worlds. By the 19th century, however, a new kind of artificial light was on the rise: gas. Cities laid networks of cast-iron pipes beneath their streets, feeding coal gas to burners in lamps that glowed brighter and more steadily than candles. And the first public demonstrations, such as those staged by the German-born entrepreneur Frederick Windsor in London around 1807, drew skeptics and marvellers alike, as entire facades were suddenly washed in a white-yellow glare that seemed almost supernatural compared to the warm, flickering pools of oil or tallow. Gaslight extended not only the reach of illumination, but its intensity. Railways, too, colonised the dark. By the 1840s and 1850s, trains were running through the night across Europe and North America, their locomotive headlights casting long beams down the tracks, while inside carriages, gas or later oil lamps allowed passengers to read, gossip, or simply stare at their own reflections superimposed on black landscapes outside. The expansion of timetables across regions eventually forced the adoption of standardized time zones, with the United States implementing a system of 4 time belts in 1883, which effectively synchronized what night meant across vast territories where previously each town had set its own clocks by local noon. In these same decades, urban nightlife diversified into specialized zones, entertainment districts with music halls and dance venues lit by rows of gas lamps, red light districts that advertised themselves with colored glass and brighter illumination to lure customers, and bourgeois boulevards where families might stroll after dinner, window shopping under awnings while street musicians played. Painters like Gustave Caillebotte and John Atkinson Grimshaw captured the surreal quality of these new nights, with wet cobblestones gleaming under gaslight and fog turning lamp halos into luminous orbs floating in the gloom. The late 19th century brought an even more radical change. Electric light, arc lamps which produced an intense white glare by jumping current between carbon rods, appeared first in lighthouses and large public spaces, but they were blinding, hissing contraptions, suitable for illuminating entire train stations or boulevards, yet too harsh for intimate interiors. The 20th century's neon revolution pushed this idea further. After the noble gas neon was discovered, and its orange-red glow harnessed in glass tubes by Georges Claude around 1910, commercial strips in cities from Paris to Shanghai began to sprout signs that could blaze company names and abstract patterns in colours previously unseen at night: intense blues, reds, greens. By the 1930s, places like New York's Times Square or Tokyo's Ginza had become canyons of luminous text, their brilliance turning midnight almost as visually stimulating as noon, and photographers flocked to capture reflections of neon in puddles and chrome fenders. Yet, while commercial and entertainment districts revelled in ever brighter nights, other institutions used darkness tactically. Armies throughout history had exploited night for surprise attacks, but the combination of aviation and electric cityscapes in the 20th century led to new forms of nocturnal warfare, as bomber fleets navigated by stars or primitive instruments toward glowing targets, forcing besieged cities to institute blackouts that reversed decades of progress in illumination and plunged entire metropolises into intentionally engineered darkness. During the Second World War, Londoners experienced such blackouts intensely. Street lamps were switched off or severely dimmed, windows were covered with heavy curtains, car headlights were hooded, and people learned to grope their way along familiar routes by touch and faint memory. While at the same time, those who managed to climb hills or visit rural areas during the war years often remarked on the astonishing visibility of the Milky Way and meteor showers, a reminder that beneath the artificial brightening and dimming orchestrated by human conflict, the natural night sky continued its eternal display, only intermittently visible. Blackout regulations changed habits in surprising ways. Accident rates from traffic collisions. In mid-20th century experiments, subjects kept in environments with no external time cues tended to adopt sleep-wake cycles slightly longer than 24 hours, their internal clocks free-running, while later studies in the 1990s by researchers like Thomas Baer at the National Institutes of Health showed that when modern people were exposed only to dim light and long nights akin to pre-industrial winters, they spontaneously drifted towards segmented sleep patterns, mirroring the first and second sleeps documented in early modern Europe, suggesting that many of our difficulties with insomnia and fatigue stem from a mismatch between our biology and the relentless light of the modern world. Outside the laboratory, cities in the second half of the 20th century embraced the idea of the 24-hour metropolis as a badge of cosmopolitanism. New York touted itself as the city that never sleeps, with subway lines running all night and diners open at 3 a.m, while in Tokyo, some districts blazed with fluorescent and neon signage until dawn, hosting late-night karaoke bars, manga cafes and convenience stores whose strip-lit interiors offered a timeless, placeless glow, so that a shift worker or insomniac student could buy a boxed meal or magazine at an hour when, a century earlier, only bakers and patrolmen would have been awake. The result of this relentless expansion of light, however, has been a profound transformation of the night sky itself. Astronomers and environmentalists now speak of a light pollution, a blanket of artificial brightness that obscures faint stars and even whole swathes of the Milky Way, with satellite images showing vast regions of North America. Yet astronomy has also transcended the literal night by moving above the Earth's atmosphere. The Hubble Space Telescope, launched in 1990, orbits the planet every 97 minutes, passing from daylight to darkness and back repeatedly, but for its instruments, there is no difference between terrestrial day or night, only the presence or absence of direct sunlight and earthshine, and its most famous images, like the Hubble Deep Field, are essentially ultra-long nights pointed at small patches of sky that seemed almost empty, revealing thousands of faint galaxies and reminding us that the darkness we see is rarely truly empty, merely a threshold beyond which our eyes, unaided, cannot penetrate. On the ground, ordinary people have not entirely lost contact with unspoiled night. National parks and designated dark sky reserves, such as Mont Mégantic in Quebec or Rocky Mackenzie in New Zealand, promote astrotourism, inviting visitors to experience what pre-industrial skies may have looked like, with the Milky Way casting a dim shadow and satellites gliding silently across constellations, and those who have grown up under grey urban heavens often describe these encounters as visceral shocks, a sudden recognition of how much of the universe modern lighting has hidden from view. At the same time, ecologists have come to appreciate night as a crucial dimension of ecosystems, with artificial light at night disrupting behaviours honed over millions of years. Sea turtle hatchlings, for instance, evolved to crawl toward the brightest horizon, usually the moon and stars reflected on the sea. But coastal development has created shorelines where the human health too bears the mark of altered nights. Epidemiological studies have linked chronic exposure to bright light at night, common among shift workers or those living in densely lit urban environments, to increased risks of metabolic disorders, certain cancers, and mood disturbances, possibly due to suppression of melatonin, the hormone that rises in darkness and helps regulate circadian rhythms. And there are haunting hints that the cost of making every hour available for economic activity is paid slowly, cumulatively, in bodies whose cellular clocks depend on the reliable alternation of light and dark. Digital devices introduce another twist. Smartphones, tablets, and computer screens emit disproportionately high levels of blue light, which is especially potent at delaying melatonin release. So millions of people now lie in bed scrolling through glowing rectangles, telling their brains, in effect, that it is still afternoon. The age-old pattern of quiet, low-light winding down has been replaced in many households by a last blast of luminous information, compressing the time between intense cognitive engagement and attempted sleep into mere minutes, and sleep physicians warn that this habit may be undermining the restorative power of what slumber remains, Despite this, night retains a stubborn capacity to resist total colonization. In power outages caused by storms or grid failures, whole neighborhoods suddenly rediscover the natural night, as street lamps wink out and stars emerge where none were visible minutes before, and these brief, involuntary returns to pre-electric darkness often inspire both anxiety and wonder. As people look up from candlelit board games or impromptu street conversations and notice constellations they have never named, experiencing their own familiar streets as temporarily foreign terrain. Globally, access to night is itself unequal. In wealthy neighborhoods of major cities, bright lighting is often installed as a security measure, whether effective or not, while poorer districts may be either underlit, making residents vulnerable to crime or accidents, or flooded with harsh, poorly shielded fixtures that glare into windows and wash out stars, and debates over right to light and right to dark pit concerns about safety against those about sleep, environment and cultural heritage. Because for some communities, the night sky is an element of identity, encoded in story, song and navigation. Meanwhile, in regions near Earth's poles, the very structure of night differs dramatically from daily alternation. In Arctic and Antarctic circles, winter brings the long polar night, weeks or months when the sun never rises fully above the horizon, and human adaptations to this regime have been diverse. Indigenous peoples like the Sami or Inuit traditionally organized work, rest and ritual around the presence or absence of twilight and moonlight, rather than strict clock time, while modern researchers and military personnel stationed in polar bases struggle with winter over syndrome, a cluster of mood and sleep disturbances attributed in part to the unbroken darkness outside. The aurora borealis and australis add another layer to these high-latitude nights. Shimmering curtains of green, red and purple light driven by charged particles from the sun interacting with Earth's magnetic field dance silently overhead, sometimes bright enough to read by, and for centuries these displays have fed myths of spirits, battles or omens, while modern physics decodes them as visible fingerprints of space weather, reminding observers that even in the darkest hours, the planet is bathed in unseen streams of energy from beyond. On the opposite extreme, near the equator, nights are comparatively uniform in length across seasons, a stability that has informed agricultural and religious cycles. In many equatorial cultures, the almost immediate transition from day to night during rapid tropical sunsets has given rise to rituals that must be completed before darkness falls, because dusk itself is fleeting, and night descends not as a slow fade but as a quick curtain, sending people scurrying indoors or to evening gatherings with less of the drawn-out twilight familiar to temperate zones. Beyond Earth, other worlds host nights of extraordinary variety. On the Moon, a lunar night lasts roughly 14 Earth days, during which temperatures plunge and the landscape is bathed only in the feeble Earthlight and distant starlight, posing engineering challenges for potential long-term bases that must endure extended periods without solar power. While on tidally locked exoplanets, those that always show the same face to their star, astronomers imagine hemispheres of perpetual day and perpetual night, with bizarre Terminator twilight zones between them, where conditions might, in theory, allow life, underscoring that our familiar spinning alternation is only one possible pattern among many. Mars, with a rotation only slightly longer than Earth's, has recognizable nights and days, but its thinner atmosphere and dust-laden skies give its darkness a different texture. Once humans walk there in numbers, their relationship to Martian night, how they light habitats, whether they venture out under a salmon-tinged sky to watch Phobos and Deimos rise, what myths they attach to strange constellations, will form a new chapter in the history of night, one in which our species exports its habitual fear and fascination with darkness to another world. Back on Earth, artists, writers and musicians continue to mine night as both setting and symbol. From Van Gogh's swirling Starry Night, painted while he looked out from a sanatorium window at the small Provençal town of Saint-Rémy under a turbid yet luminous sky, to jazz clubs whose dim interiors foster a sense of intimacy and experimentation, cultural production has often thrived at hours when mainstream institutions sleep, and bohemian subcultures from Parisian flaneurs to Berlin techno scenes have made a virtue of the nocturnal, treating the hours between midnight and dawn as spaces of creative freedom. Photography revolutionized our ability to document and aestheticize night. Early long exposures of gaslit streets showed ghostly blurs where pedestrians passed, while today's high ISO digital cameras can reveal the Milky Way arching above modestly lit farmhouses, bridging the human and the cosmic in single frames, and time-lapse films compress hours of nocturnal movement. Clouds racing by, stars wheeling overhead, city lights flickering into seconds. Even in the most technologically saturated environments, certain professions and rituals still hinge on natural night. Astronomers at small observatories time their work to moonless windows, calling these dark runs and planning months ahead. Farmers watch frost advisories and sometimes stay up, smudging orchards with fires or spraying water to protect blossoms if a cold snap strikes after sunset. Surfers speak reverently of bioluminescent night sessions, when breaking waves glow an electric blue from plankton, as if the ocean itself were reacting to the absence of daylight by revealing a hidden palette. At the same time, countless informal and personal practices cluster around night, secret keepers choosing late hours to confess or unburden themselves, trusting that sleep-softened consciousness makes listeners more permeable, children learning constellations from grandparents, pointing with gnarled fingers at scattered patterns overhead, using stories to bind stars into shapes. Urban teenagers roaming as flaneurs through half-lit streets, feeling that the city belongs more to them when most adults are behind closed doors. The familiar shops and bus stops charged with a faint outlaw thrill simply because they are encountered after dark. In all these ways, night reveals itself not as a mere absence of light, but as a distinctive environment, historically mutable and culturally constructed, an arena where technological innovations, religious beliefs, economic imperatives, ecological system, later, medieval European law codes inherited and elaborated this idea, listing separate penalties for night walking with malicious intent, and court rolls from England or the German lands reveal that juries and judges often asked witnesses exactly when the first suspicious sound was heard, whether the moon was up or clouds covered it, whether neighbours could see shadows moving near the door. A burglary between dusk and dawn might be classified as burglum de nocte, attracting harsher punishment than an identical break-in after sunrise, the darkness itself treated like an accomplice. This legal suspicion of the night was not confined to property crimes. Across early modern Europe, ordinances warned against night assemblies of apprentices or servants, and soldiers caught gambling or brawling after taps risked more severe discipline than if they had done so during permitted leisure hours, because authorities feared that grievances once aired in the privacy of darkness could ferment into mutiny far from the watchful eyes of officers. So the drumbeat of regulation tried to press human sociality back into daylight, where it could be supervised. In colonial settings, such anxieties took an even sharper edge, especially where enslaved or subjugated populations vastly outnumbered free settlers. In the slave societies of the Caribbean and the American South, slave codes routinely forbade enslaved people from travelling after dark without written passes, and patrols of white men on horseback rode on the mainland of North America. Enslaved people seeking freedom via what would later be romanticised as the Underground Railroad also relied heavily on night, walking barefoot to muffle sound, timing departures so that their owners' households were in their deepest sleep following faint landmarks that looked utterly different under starlight than by day. Some accounts describe fugitives learning to identify the North Star, Polaris, as a fixed point above the horizon, a beacon toward free states, and while the famous spiritual Follow the Drinking Gourd has uncertain origins, its imagery hints at ways in which knowledge of the night sky could be encoded into songs as covert guides. For those who assisted such escapes, night became both ally and peril. Figures like Harriet Tubman moved small groups through marshes and thickets during the darkest hours, crouching still whenever dogs barked in the distance or riders' silhouettes broke the horizon, and Tubman reportedly timed journeys to phases of the moon, sometimes preferring its concealment for stealth, other times its faint light to avoid swamps and ravines, turning lunar cycles into a tactical calendar inscribed not on paper but in memory and muscle. Elsewhere, under very different circumstances, revolutionaries and dissidents across centuries have retreated into the shelter of night to plan, print and conspire. During the French Revolution, pamphleteers frequently set their presses running after midnight to spew broadsides before police could trace them, the clatter of type and the smell of ink filling cramped rooms, illuminated by a few candles dipped low to avoid showing at shutter cracks, while in Tsarist Russia, and later in Soviet times, samizdat texts were laboriously typed or mimeographed in apartments, where curtains were. Yet night has also been seized by protesters as a stage for visibility, especially once electric illumination allowed them to choreograph their own lighting. Candlelight marches, such as those in 1980s South Korea against dictatorial rule, or the 1989 vigils in Prague's Wenceslas Square, used points of flame held aloft not just as symbols of hope, but as a way to render each participant's face visible to others in the crowd, creating a moving constellation of individuals whose collective glow pushed back against the shadows of repression, while television cameras, hungry for striking images, transmitted these nocturnal seas of light around the world. Religious traditions, long before modern politics, had already woven night into their holiest times, and if one listens to the calendar of sacred days across cultures, darkness appears again and again as a favoured hour for revelation, atonement, or celebration. In Judaism, for example, the very day begins at nightfall, following the Genesis formula of "and there was evening and there was morning," so that major holidays commence not at dawn but with the appearing of 3 stars in the sky, their first faint twinkles serving as cosmic clock hands. The Passover Seder, commemorating the Exodus from Egypt, is held on such a night, with families and guests gathered around tables lit by candles or electric light, retelling a story of liberation that took place, according to the Book of Exodus, during a terrible night of death and hurried departure, and in synagogues on the eve of Yom Kippur, the most solemn day of atonement. The haunting melody of Kol Nidre is chanted as darkness falls, its ancient Aramaic legal formula releasing vows and binding the congregation into a shared awareness of transience that feels intensified by the enveloping night outside. Another Jewish ritual that explicitly embraces nocturnal wakefulness is the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the repair of the night of Shavuot, in which communities study Torah and other texts all night on the festival that marks the giving of the law at Sinai, turning the hours when most of the city sleeps into a long, caffeinated meditation punctuated by classes, discussions, and the rustle of pages, so that when dawn finally filters through stained glass or blinds, it carries a sense of both physical exhaustion and spiritual renewal. In Islam, beyond the daily pattern of 5 prayers tied to the sun's path, there lies the singular night of power, Laylat al-Qadr, believed to be the night when the Quran was first revealed to the Prophet Muhammad and described in the Quran itself as better than 1,000 months. Occurring during the last 10 nights of Ramadan, it is sought with special devotional intensity as believers crowd mosques or pray at home. In many Muslim-majority cities, these final Ramadan nights have their own social and sonic textures. Reciters' voices broadcast from minarets until well after midnight. Lights inside mosques burn brighter than usual. Neighbourhood mosques that are half empty at dawn prayers during the rest of the year overflow with bodies for the special Tarawih and later Qiyam al-Layl prayers. And children, allowed to stay up later than usual, form memories in which holiness is forever associated with an hour when, on ordinary days, they would be in bed. Hindu practice, spread across a vast array of regional and sectarian traditions, also accords important roles to night. Diwali, the festival of lights, celebrates the triumph of light over darkness and good over evil, and while it has daytime elements, its emotional heart lies in the evening when rows of deepar, earthenware oil lamps, or modern LEDs are lit along balconies, windowsills, and courtyards, turning cities and villages alike into glittering tapestries where every flame marks a household, participating in a cosmic drama that is made visible only once the sky has gone black. Another major Hindu observance, Mahashivaratri, the great night of Shiva, takes place during the dark fortnight of a specific lunar month, and, as its name suggests, stretches across the entire night. Devotees fast, offer bell leaves and water to lingams, and keep vigil in temples filled with incense and chants, often listening to discourses on mythology and philosophy until morning, believing that consciousness is especially receptive to Shiva's grace when fatigue has stripped away some of the mind's usual restlessness in the small hours. Popular devotional practices like Jagrata or Jagran, literally wakefulness, are common in parts of North India, where entire communities may gather outdoors or in temples for all-night singing of bhajans in honour of a deity or saint, with rotating groups of musicians and singers taking over as others tire. Tea vendors do brisk business, children doze on mats, and the repetition of melodies under floodlights or lanterns creates a hypnotic atmosphere that fuses the social and the spiritual into a shared vigil against both physical and symbolic sleep. In Buddhist contexts, particularly in Theravada countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar and Thailand, full moon nights are marked by uposatha observances, when lay people may take on additional precepts and spend the day and night in meditation centres or monasteries, listening to sermons until late, and sometimes sitting or walking in meditation under moonlight that bathes white stupas in a pale, serene glow, reinforcing teachings on impermanence as shadows slowly shift along walls and the sound of insects swells and fades. Zen monasteries in Japan structure their intensive retreats, sesshin, around early pre-dawn hours when the sky is still dark. Practitioners may be shaken awake at 3 a.m. to sit motionless in cold zendo halls lit only by a few lamps, and for them, the hardest part of the night is not the fear of demons, but the battle with drowsiness, the effort to keep the spine straight and the breath steady, as crickets chirp beyond shoji screens and the scent of incense curls slowly in the low light. Shinto, Japan's indigenous tradition, likewise cherishes certain nights when shrines become nodes of communal festivity. In summer Matsuri, streets leading to shrine gates are often lined with paper lanterns, their soft amber light reflecting on rows of food stalls and yukata-clad visitors. And in some regions, floats bearing portable shrines are pulled through town after dark, accompanied by drums and flutes, so that the deities are, symbolically, taken out for a night stroll among their human neighbours. Obon, the Japanese festival honouring ancestral spirits, reaches its emotional climax at night with Toro Nagashi, the floating of lanterns on rivers and seas. As dusk deepens, families place candles inside paper lanterns and set them adrift, watching as hundreds of tiny moving lights bob and drift away into the darkness, a visual metaphor for the souls returning to the other world, and for a few minutes the boundary between living and dead seems to shimmer in the shared contemplation of those receding points of flame. In parts of West Africa, masking traditions such as the Yoruba Egungun also rely on the transformative power of night. Masked figures representing ancestral spirits may appear in late afternoon and continue dancing into the evening, their elaborate costumes swirling in torch or flashlight beams, and as the natural light dims, the performer's anonymity deepens, amplifying the sense that something other than ordinary human bodies is moving in the circle, while drumming patterns shift into rhythms reserved for nocturnal rituals not played during mundane daylight events. Away from ritual and into the circuits of labour, night has been both burden and opportunity, reshaping class structures in ways made more visible in the 19th and 20th centuries as new technologies demanded round-the-clock operation. Telegraph offices, for instance, had to staff operators at all hours once messages could be sent instantaneously, and reports from the era describe lonely telegraphists in small towns, tapping out coded letters in dimly lit rooms while the rest of the settlement slept, relaying news of wars, market prices, or births and deaths that would only be read the following morning. Lighthouse keepers formed another distinctive nocturnal profession. Marooned on headlands or isolated towers at sea, they kept lamps or later Fresnel lenses burning bright through long stretches of darkness, climbing stairs to trim wicks, polish glass, and check fuel reserves while gales howled outside and waves smashed against stone walls. Their entire vocation centred on maintaining a steady beam whose sweeping arc, cutting through blackness, could mean the difference between a safe passage and a shipwreck for unseen mariners. With the spread of telephone networks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, switchboard operators, often women known in some countries as hello girls, also found themselves working shifts that extended deep into the night, connecting calls from insomniac doctors, emergency services, or lonely callers. Their fingers dancing over cords and jacks in rooms lit by shaded lamps to reduce glare on glistening cords, and memoirs from such operators mention the way night calls felt different in tone, more urgent or more intimate, as if the darkness at each end of the line seeped into the conversation. Newspapers, too, are creatures of the night. Long after reporters have filed their stories, compositors, typesetters, printers, and truck drivers labour in press rooms full of clanging machinery and the smell of ink, churning out thousands of copies before dawn, so that the morning paper is, in reality, a monument to nocturnal industry, and in the great metropolitan dailies of the mid-20th century, the last edition often rolled off presses moments before the first commuters descended into subways, a choreography of darkness and distribution most readers never considered as they unfolded fresh pages over breakfast. Hospitals, which cannot close, maintain fully fledged parallel societies at night. Nurses make rounds under dimmed corridor lights, pharmacists in basement dispensaries prepare medications for early morning surgeries, cleaning staff sterilise operating theatres, laboratory technicians process blood samples brought in by emergency cases, and on-call surgeons doze fitfully in nearby rooms, their sleep always hovering near the surface, ready to be shattered by a ringing pager that will pull them into bright operating lamps and sharp instruments while the city streets outside remain mostly deserted. As the 20th century progressed, more and more sectors adopted what came to be known as the graveyard shift, or third shift, a regular slot of work from late evening into early morning, filling factories, warehouses, power plants, and later data centres with human presence at hours once reserved for rest. Sociologists studying shift workers found that their social lives and circadian rhythms profoundly diverge from those of daytime workers, with families eating dinner at what others considered lunchtime, friendships formed almost exclusively among fellow night shifters, and a subtle sense of living in a parallel version of society that occupied the same physical spaces but at different times. In many countries, immigrants and the poor disproportionately staff these nocturnal roles. Cleaners who vacuum office carpets at midnight so that executives will find everything pristine when they arrive at 9, street sweepers hosing down avenues just before dawn, warehouse pickers racing to fill online orders in windowless facilities whose interior lighting erases the very concept of outside time, creating a sort of artificial, perpetual quasi-day in which the only indicators of night's passage are exhaustion and the changing playlists on workers' headphones. Psychologists and paediatricians, meanwhile, have long been fascinated by the way individuals respond emotionally to darkness, especially children who often articulate fears of monsters, thieves, or ghosts once the lights go out. Experiments in developmental psychology suggest that fear of the dark peaks in early childhood and gradually subsides, though for some it morphs into adult anxiety, and part of this reaction seems dreams themselves, though not confined to night in a literal sense, have been culturally tethered to darkness for obvious reasons. Sleep tends to align with night, and the surreal images produced during rapid eye movement sleep have often been interpreted as messages, prophecies, or visitations. Ancient Mesopotamians kept dream journals on clay tablets. Egyptian priests oversaw special sleep temples, where the sick could incubate curative dreams, and in many societies the stories people told each other upon waking tethered the foggy inner nights of the mind to the outer night sky that still lingered beyond their doorways. Animals, of course, have their own complex relationships with night, forged over evolutionary timescales. Anatomists examining the eyes of nocturnal mammals find that they are packed with rod cells, which are far more sensitive to low light than the colour-detecting cones that dominate the eyes of diurnal species, and in many predators, from cats to owls, the retina is backed by a reflective layer, the tapetum lucidum, which bounces photons back through the photoreceptor layer for a second chance at detection, producing the familiar eerie eye shine seen when headlights or flashlights catch them after dark. Owls exemplify nocturnal specialization. Their enormous forward-facing eyes provide binocular vision and high resolution. Their retinas bristle with rods, and their facial discs funnel sound toward asymmetrically placed ear openings, allowing them to pinpoint the rustle of a mouse in leaf litter, even when starlight is too faint for vision alone. Combined with feathers adapted for near-silent flight, whose fringed edges break up turbulences that would otherwise produce noise, these traits make the owl a near-perfect nocturnal hunter, a sort of living instrument built to read the faint signals that night still permits. Bats, often maligned in folklore, are another extraordinary example, having largely surrendered visual dominance in favour of echolocation, emitting ultrasonic chirps and listening for their echoes to build real-time acoustic maps of their surroundings. In caves or twilight skies, a bat can detect tiny insects and avoid obstacles with precision rivaling that of radar, and different species tune their calls to different frequency bands and habitats, some skimming above water surfaces, others threading through densely branched forests, all exploiting a sensory modality that thrives when light is scarce. Nocturnal insects, too, have evolved remarkable capabilities. Certain moths possess ears tuned to the ultrasonic cries of bats, giving them precious milliseconds to perform evasive maneuvers, while fireflies in many regions light up meadows and forests on summer nights with bioluminescent signalling patterns used to attract mates, each species coding its identity in specific blink sequences, short long pauses, quick double flashes, and in some Southeast Asian mangrove forests, thousands of fireflies synchronize their flashing on riverbank trees, pulsing in unison like living chandeliers suspended over black water. In the oceans, where sunlight fails beyond a few hundred meters, an eternal night reigns that nonetheless teems with life. Here, bioluminescence is ubiquitous, with anglerfish dangling glowing lures in front of enormous jaws, comb jellies trailing iridescent ribbons of light, and countless plankton emitting tiny sparks when disturbed, so that a diver switching off artificial lights and waving a hand through the water can see a cascade of blue-green pinpricks swirling around their fingers, evidence that in many ecosystems darkness is not an absence of visual phenomena, but a canvas on which organisms paint with their own chemical light. Many marine species participate in what biologists call diel vertical migration, the largest daily movement of biomass on Earth, rising toward the surface at night to feed and sinking back into deeper, darker layers by day to avoid visual predators, effectively using the rotation-driven alternation of light and dark as a conveyor belt guiding their movements, a planetary-scale choreography playing out every night beneath the waves, unnoticed by humans except through remote sensing and net samples hauled from the deep. Even plants engage with night in subtle but far-reaching ways. Some species, like the night-blooming cereus or certain varieties of jasmine, open their flowers only after sunset, releasing strong fragrances to attract nocturnal moths or bats as pollinators, while closing again by morning, a strategy that reduces competition for pollinator attention and avoids heat damage to delicate floral tissues. And at the molecular level, plant cells express different sets of genes depending on the hour, with circadian clocks controlling growth, hormone release, and metabolic processes that respond to the absence of sunlight as much as to its presence. Human scientists have learned to harness the quiet and stability of night for endeavours unrelated to stargazing. Meteorologists, for instance, launch weather balloons at standardized times, often including midnight UTC, to sample temperature, humidity, and wind profiles through the atmosphere. And in remote field sites, these nighttime launches take place under the glow of headlamps and handheld flashlights, with the inflated white balloon rising like a pale ghost into the black sky, carrying instruments whose data will feed forecasting models for cities that may never see the stars behind their clouds and lights. Physicists studying cosmic rays, high-energy particles from outer space that incessantly bombard Earth, have built detectors in deep underground laboratories, shielded from daytime temperature fluctuations and background radiation. And while these instruments run continuously, nights at such facilities have a distinctive feel, with skeleton crews monitoring computer screens in rooms lit by the cold glow of monitors, acutely aware that miles above them, on clear nights, the same particles are triggering faint flashes in the upper atmosphere, part of a ceaseless storm we perceive only through indirect traces. Gigantic interferometers searching for gravitational waves such as LIGO in the United States or Virgo in Italy also function around the clock. But technicians and scientists have noted that nights, especially in rural settings, often bring less human-made vibration. Fewer trucks on nearby highways, less activity in neighbouring facilities, leading to slightly quieter baselines in their exquisitely sensitive instruments, so that when a burst from colliding black holes washes past at 3 a.m. local time, it may literally stand out more clearly against the hush of sleeping civilization. Far above these ground-based experiments, astronauts aboard the International Space Station inhabit an environment where the familiar anchoring of night and day is radically compressed. Orbiting Earth roughly every 90 minutes, they experience about 16 sunrises and sunsets in a terrestrial 24-hour period, with the terminator, the line between day and night, racing across continents beneath them in a constant blur. Yet to maintain their health, they follow a strict lighting schedule that simulates a single day-night. They also witness natural nocturnal phenomena from a vantage point unimaginable to earlier skywatchers. The auroral ovals encircling polar regions as shimmering curtains viewed from above rather than below, airglow, faint bands of atmospheric luminescence, ringing the limb of the planet like a thin green halo, and meteors streaking into the atmosphere as burning threads far beneath, reminding them that what most people think of as the night sky is, in fact, a vast volume of layered processes, some of which can only be appreciated from orbit. Back on the ground, entire urban economies now revolve around the pleasures and perils of late hours, building on but far exceeding the taverns and cabarets of earlier centuries, the explosion of nightclub culture after the Second World War. From jazz clubs in New Orleans and Harlem, to discotheques in 1970s Paris and Munich, and techno clubs in post-Cold War Berlin, turned the dark hours into theatres of sound and movement where people could temporarily shed daytime roles and hierarchies, bodies pulsing in sync with strobes and bass lines, faces rendered intermittently visible in flashes of coloured light. These nighttime zones have often strained against regulatory frameworks built for a diurnal society. City councils debate closing times, noise ordinances and liquor licences, while club owners lobby for recognition of nighttime economies as legitimate engines of employment and tourism, arguing that bartenders, DJs, bouncers and taxi drivers constitute an ecosystem as real as that of office workers, only shifted by several hours, and some cities, like Amsterdam and Sydney, have introduced night mayors, or equivalent officials dedicated to managing this parallel civic rhythm. Public transport has had to adapt as well. Night buses in London, Ratpi Noctillion services in Paris, and all-night subway lines in New York or Seoul knit together nocturnal districts with residential neighbourhoods, their dim carriages filled with a mix of exhausted workers headed home from shifts, revellers still giddy or sick from clubbing, students clutching books after late study sessions and the occasional sleeper slumped against a window, head bobbing with the train's sway as stations slide by in a blur of fluorescent-lit platforms. Gender has shaped access to the night in complex ways. For much of recorded history, women moving alone after dark in urban spaces risked social stigma or physical danger. And even in contemporary cities, surveys routinely report that women feel substantially less safe than men walking through parks or side streets at night, prompting campaigns for better lighting, more visible policing, or women-only taxi services. Yet feminist groups have also reclaimed night through events like Take Back the Night marches, insisting that the hours after sunset should not belong solely to fear, predators, or the hyper-masculinized arenas of certain nightlife scenes. Queer communities, marginalized in many daytime workplaces and families, have historically found relative refuge in nocturnal venues. Secret bars during Prohibition-era America, underground clubs in mid-century London, cruising grounds in shadowed parks, and later, openly gay discos lit by mirror balls and black lights where same-sex couples could dance without fear, at least inside the door, so that for many LGBTQ+ elders, memories of first kisses or moments of recognition are inextricably bound to smoky rooms and neon signs glimpsed down dark alleys. Technology continues to mutate the texture of night in less visible but pervasive ways. The LED revolution of recent decades, which has replaced incandescent and many gas discharge lamps with light-emitting diodes, has dramatically reduced the energy cost of illumination, but also flooded landscapes with cooler, bluer spectra that scatter more in the atmosphere and penetrate more deeply into human and animal eyes, prompting debates over colour temperature in outdoor lighting and driving some municipalities to retrofit installations with warmer amber-coloured LEDs to mitigate both glare and circadian disruption. Smart street lighting systems now allow cities to dim or brighten lights dynamically based on time, weather, or detected movement, so that a residential block might sit at half brightness during the deepest night hours, only ramping up when a car or pedestrian passes, balancing energy savings and dark sky goals against residents' desire for perceived safety. Algorithms crunch data from sensors and adjust luminous flux in ways that would have seemed like sorcery to gaslight-era lamplighters who went around with poles and flame, igniting wicks one by one at dusk. Environmental legislation has begun to treat darkness as a resource worth protecting. In France, regulations introduced in the 2010s require most office buildings and shops to extinguish interior lights at night when not in use, and neon signage must be shut off in the small hours, reducing both energy waste and light pollution, while in parts of Germany, Switzerland and the United States, Local ordinances specify that new outdoor lighting be fully shielded, directing beams downward rather than up or sideways, effectively carving out pockets where stars remain visible above quiet neighbourhoods. Movements advocating for dark sky reserves and dark sky communities, recognised by organisations like the International Dark Sky Association, have persuaded towns near observatories or national parks to adopt lighting codes that keep nights relatively pristine, ensuring that visitors can step outside lodges or campsites and see the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon. And in these places, tourism brochures advertise not just beaches or mountains, but darkness itself as an attraction, a rare commodity in a world where many children have never known a truly star-filled sky. Looking ahead, technologists imagine even more intimate interactions between light, night, and human bodies. Glasses and room systems that subtly adjust spectral composition throughout the evening to support healthy melatonin cycles while still allowing reading and screen use. Augmented reality devices that can overlay navigational aids on dark streets without flooding surroundings with stray lumens. Perhaps even personal drones carrying moving lanterns that follow a walker home through unlit paths, bringing a portable, focused circle of safety without permanently brightening entire neighbourhoods. Yet no matter how finely we tune our circuits, the planetary rotation that has structured every life that ever lived will continue, delivering dusk and dawn with metronomic reliability. And as long as there are people awake to notice, somewhere there will be someone pausing at a window or a doorway, listening to the particular quiet of that hour, sensing in the way air cools and sounds carry, in the shift of bird calls from day singers to night hooters, that they are standing inside a vast ancient cycle far older than any law code, gasworks, or glowing screen.